This is the Puente Hills landfill outside Los Angeles, California. The first truckload of trash was dumped here in 1957, and the trucks just kept coming. For more than 5 decades, if you threw something away in LA County, there's a good chance it's buried somewhere in this mountain of waste. At its peak, Puente Hills was accepting around 4 million tons of trash every year, making it one of the largest landfills in the country. It closed in 2013, creating a time capsule of everyday life and consumption patterns over the span of 56 years. But Puente Hills is also a time capsule of landfill engineering itself. In 1976, right in the middle of its lifespan, sweeping federal regulations changed how we deal with solid waste forever. You probably don't think too much about where your trash goes, and that's kind of the whole point of the solid waste industry, to make sure you have the ability to throw something away without it having a serious negative consequence on the environment or public health. There's a larger conversation to be had about the amount of waste we generate and how much of it can be recycled or reused, but there's always going to be stuff that just doesn't hold enough value to be kept. Trash is an inescapable element of the human condition, and I think you're going to be surprised at how complicated that really is. When Puente Hills opened in the 50s, a landfill was pretty much just a hole in the ground where trash was dumped. By the time it closed, landfills were highly engineered holes where trash gets dumped. And I have a scale model of a landfill in the garage to show you how it all works. I'm Grady, and this is Practical Engineering. There are lots of kinds of waste in this crazy world, but one of the biggest sources is just you and me throwing stuff in the trash. The technical term is municipal solid waste, since its collection is usually coordinated at the city level. There are a lot of ways to manage it once it's collected, but the most common by far is disposal in a landfill. And one of the biggest parts of landfill engineering is just deciding where to put one in the first place. The main goal of a landfill is to maximize the volume of waste that can be stored there, while minimizing the cost and the environmental impacts too, which turns choosing a suitable site into a giant geometry problem. Digging a hole sounds like an obvious choice, but consider this. Digging a hole is expensive, and not digging a hole is free. There are costs of excavating tons and tons of soil just to get it out of the way so it can be replaced with trash, and costs of hauling away all that soil, since your goal is to maximize the volume on the site. Plus, you have to avoid the water table, any unsuitable geology, and the challenges of building and working deep below the surface of the earth. That's why landfills mostly build up into what sanitation professionals call the airspace. Looking upward, it may seem the sky is the limit, but anyone who's built a tower of anything, let alone trash, knows better. The waste pile gets less stable as its height increases, requiring shallower slopes. And the pressures at the bottom go up too, which can lead to settlement and damage of facilities. Plus, there are visual impacts. The bigger the garbage heap, the bigger the eyesore, and people are only willing to look at a landfill so tall. They can't be too close to airports because they attract birds that can interfere with planes. And they can't be too close to homes, parks, playgrounds, and other places people congregate for obvious reasons. Of course, there's floodplains and wildlife habitat to avoid as well, and you don't just need a place to put the trash, you also need a scale house to weigh the trucks coming in and out, a shop and storage for the equipment, and sometimes a place for ordinary citizens to drop stuff off. Finally, you need a spot that can handle the huge increase in truck traffic coming and going practically non-stop. Pretty much, if you can get a college degree in it, it's going to come into play when siting a landfill. Geology, geography, politics, archaeology, public relations, biology, every kind of engineering, and a lot more. But once you have your landfill, you can't just start dumping trash. Let me show you why with a demonstration. And I have some help from my shop assistants. I have my hole dug, and we'll start adding some trash. So far, no major problems, but eventually it's gonna rain. And you can immediately see the issue. Granted, this is more of a flood than a drizzle, but it gets the point across. All that water is going to filter through the garbage to the bottom of the hole and eventually into the underlying soil. It might go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. We really don't want garbage juice percolating into our soils. Mainly because it can contaminate sources of groundwater, but also because it can migrate well beyond the limits of the landfill, causing all sorts of environmental troubles. So modern landfills use a bottom liner to keep waste separate from the underlying soils. Often this consists of a thick sheet of plastic, carefully tested and welded together into an impermeable membrane. Even the area between the plastic welds is tested using air pressure to make sure there are no leaks. Another option is thick clay soil, compacted to create a watertight layer. In many cases, the two options are combined, so you end up with this intricate structure of different impermeable layers stacked together. Maybe you still see a problem with the solution on its own. Now when it rains, the landfill just fills up with water. This causes issues with stability and settlement. It causes garbage to decompose more quickly, leading to odor and temperature problems. Plus, you just can't work on top. There's no way for trucks to unload trash on top of a garbage swamp. So we need a way to get the garbage juice out without letting it flow into the soil below. By the way, garbage juice is not a technical term, it's actually called leachate, so I'll use that from here on out. And all modern landfills have sophisticated leachate collection systems to keep the waste as dry as possible and avoid the issues I mentioned. Usually this consists of a system of perforated pipes covered in a layer of sand, draining to sumps and eventually leading out of the waste. I built a little leachate collection system in my model landfill using a small tube so you can see this in action. Now my clay bathtub has a drain. When the rain comes, the water that makes its way into the waste is able to flow out of the landfill, keeping it from becoming a swampy mess. This is a little simplified compared to a real landfill. I've made a video all about French drains, which is much closer to what a leachate collection system consists of if you want to learn more after this. Obviously, in my example, the leachate collection system has to penetrate the bottom liner, which can be a potential source of leaks. So these penetrations are sealed really carefully in the real world, or the collection system just uses pumps and risers that run up the slope of the landfill to the top, so no penetration system is necessary. Of course, now you have a stream of leachate you have to deal with. Actually, leachate management is one of the biggest costs of running a facility like this. Some landfills send it off to a treatment plant that can clean it up. Some have ways to treat it on-site with settling ponds, evaporation, biological treatment, and even plants that can consume and convert landfill leachate into waste that's easier to dispose of, maybe even back into the landfill itself. Finally, the bottom of our landfill has all the necessary pieces, but the work doesn't stop there. Remember that volume is everything in a landfill. For as much effort that goes into finding a location and building the infrastructure, it's essential that we get the most trash in here as possible. You probably know this, but municipal garbage just isn't that dense. Maybe you've had to smash a few more bags in the can because you missed the collection one week. If so, you know there's usually a lot of room for densification. The trucks that collect garbage usually have a way to compact it to make more room in the box before needing to be emptied. But once the trash is at the landfill, there's still an opportunity for compaction. Landfills often use massive roller compactors with enormous teeth and giant blades to grade out and compress waste and get as much as possible into the site. It saves money and it's good stewardship of the space. But density isn't the only challenge with day-to-day operations. Despite what you've heard, landfills are kind of gross. I mean, that's their whole point, to accept the stuff we don't want to put anywhere else. But putting it all in one place creates a lot of problems. Pests, odors, windblown waste, fires, birds, and more. So to mitigate some of that, most places require that the garbage be covered up at the end of every day. This daily cover can take a lot of forms. The basic approach is just to put a layer of soil over the top of the working face at the end of the day. When I do this in the model, you get a sense of the problem. All that clean daily cover is taking up precious space in the landfill. One option is to trim it back off each morning before the trucks start arriving, but that's a Sisyphean task of just moving tons and tons of soil around each day. Other alternatives for daily cover are tarps, or just holding back certain types of waste that are more inert, like foundry sand, foam, paper, and shredded tires. They're going in anyway, so you might as well use them on top to cover the more disagreeable stuff overnight. Those alternatives can also help avoid leachate getting perched within the waste, encouraging it to continue downward to the collection system. Ideally, a landfill will last for decades, slowly filling up by packing in as much waste as possible. Throughout the course of operating a landfill, there's constant testing of groundwater, surface water, leachate, air quality, and more to make sure they're not exceeding limits. Landfills are usually built in smaller cells, so you don't have to manage this huge area of waste all at once. A cell fills up, you put soil over the top called interim cover, and start a new one within the landfill. But eventually, you reach the top of the airspace, and the landfill reaches the end of its useful life. And closing a landfill is not an easy job. Of course, you have to cover all that waste up, creating a mountainous sealed tomb of garbage. That final cover has to keep the water out to reduce the volume of leachate you're having to collect and treat over time, but it also has to keep the garbage in. And not just the garbage itself, but everything else that comes with it, like smells and leachate and pests. And it has to do it basically forever. So just like the bottom liner, the final cover over a landfill is usually a system of multiple layers, including compacted soil, membranes, and fabrics. And then you have to get the grass to grow to protect the soil from erosion and damage over time. I don't have time to wait for grass to grow in my demo, so I'm cheating a little bit. But the fun isn't quite over yet. The waste may be sealed up, but that doesn't mean it's inert. In fact, there's a lot of chemistry and biology happening inside a landfill. And a lot of those reactions generate gases like methane and hydrogen sulfide that can create pressure, heat, smells, greenhouse effects in the atmosphere, and the potential for explosions. So one of the steps in landfill closure is to install wells that can collect the gases from the waste. Usually these consist of vertical pipes connected to a blower that constantly draws air to a collection point. There's a lot that goes into these systems too. You can't pull too hard or you might draw oxygen into the landfill, changing the reactions and microbiological processes and creating a potential for a fire within the waste. Plus, the gas includes a lot of humidity, so managing condensation creates another liquid stream that has to be collected and treated. Once it's collected, the landfill gas can be flared, combusting it into less environmentally harmful constituents. Another option is to put it to beneficial use to create heat or even electricity. The Puente Hills landfill I showed earlier has a gas-to-energy facility that's been running since 1987. And even though the landfill is now closed, it currently provides enough electricity to power around 70,000 homes. Once a landfill's closed, there's not a lot you can do with it after that. It's a big sealed-up mountain of trash after all. Owners are generally required to look after a closed landfill for at least 30 years afterwards, inspecting for leaks, monitoring the air and water, and repairing any damage. Those costs have to be built into the rates they charge since there's not a lot of benefit or revenue after closure. But with all that open space and carefully maintained landscaping, one option that many landfill owners are trying out is parks. And I love this idea. They say, we're willing to put our money where our mouth is and invite the public to spend time here, to enjoy this place that used to be, one of the least enjoyable places you can imagine. Puente Hills in California has big plans, including trails on the slopes, biking, slides, gardens, and more. It looks like it'll be a really nice place to visit when it's done. And it also puts the whole concept of landfills in perspective. Of course, we have a lot of room for improvement in how we think about and manage solid waste in this world. Landfills seem like an environmental blight, but really, properly designed ones play a huge role in making sure waste products don't end up in our soil or air or water. It's not possible to landfill waste everywhere. Many places are too densely populated or just don't have enough space. But where they are, the environmental impacts are relatively small. Just consider the resources that go into them. I pay about $20 a month, probably a little on the low end of the national average, and that buys me 64 gallons, about a quarter of a cubic meter of space in a municipal landfill per week. Of course, I don't fill the can every week, and that trash gets compacted, but still. Do that for a decade, and your $20 a month has paid for the volume of a modest apartment. It's covered the cost of building the lining and collection systems, the environmental monitoring, the daily operations, the closure, the gas collection, and the maintenance for at least 3 decades afterwards, and for your trash to stay there effectively forever. It's almost free real estate. Not that you'd want to live there. But my point is, landfills are a surprisingly low-impact way to manage solid waste in a lot of cases. I hope the future is a utopia where all the stuff we make maintains its beneficial value forever. But for now, I'm thankful for the sanitary engineers and the other professions involved in safely and economically dealing with our trash so we don't have to. I could spend hours talking about the engineering that goes into landfills. There are just so many practical challenges that you really don't face anywhere else in engineering, and it's kind of a small club of people who work on them and know a lot about them. I love that.
It's August 5, 2010 at the San Jose Gold and Copper Mine in Chile. And more than 2,000 feet below the surface, a couple of miners notice a faint rumbling sound echoing through the rocks. The miners have heard rumblings like this before as the rock adjusts to new excavations. But today, these rumblings are much more frequent than usual. The time is 2 p.m. and the workers are trying to wrap up as much work as possible before they will be picked up by a work truck, which will drive them all the way to the surface for lunch. But then, suddenly, they hear something much louder than the previous rumblings. The blast sends those working on the higher levels of the mine to the ground and causes the tunnels and shafts to collapse. Large rocks tumble down, sweeping across the workers, and all they can do is hang on to them and ride out. The workers have no way of knowing yet, but the San Jose mine has just collapsed, trapping them beneath the surface. The mine is located in the Atacama Desert, one of the driest areas in the world. Conditions here are so extreme that the site is often used for simulations of Mars expeditions. And yet, the Atacama Desert is an incredibly valuable asset to Chile. And that is because of what lies beneath. Abundant mineral resources, from copper to silver to gold. When looking at the mine from above ground, its true scale is hidden. To go in, there's an unassuming 5 by 5 meter entrance, and it leads to a tunnel known as the ramp that spirals downwards with several branching paths leading off into the mountain. The workers orient themselves underground based on a level system using sea level for reference. The entrance is at level 720, which is 720 meters above sea. When the mine collapsed, some of the workers were as deep as level 40. In the immediate aftermath of the collapse, some of the workers try to make a break for the surface. They get into a truck and drive up the ramp. However, they quickly get stuck, as the road is so littered with debris that they need to continue on foot. They reach level 190, where they find the cause of the collapse. A giant slab of diorite, estimated as tall as a 45-story building and weighing 770,000 tons, has broken off from the mountain and crashed down the mine, completely blocking the ramp. The workers are trapped, and their only option now is to retreat back down. Located at level 90, there is a small enclosed space known as the refuge. It is designated as an emergency shelter area for situations like this. Fresh air is pumped in from the surface, and emergency food and medicine is locked in metal cabinets that are to be opened should the need arise. As the workers descend back down into the mine, the word spreads of the collapse, until the news eventually reaches the shift supervisor, Luis Orzua, who is working at level 90. He orders the workers to take shelter in the refuge and heads down further into the mine to evacuate those working below. Because of the distance from the collapse and ear protection worn by the man, those down below didn't realize what was happening until Orzua orders them to the refuge. Once everyone has gathered together, Urzura then conducts a roll call and counts 33 men trapped. With the ramp completely closed, some of the workers realize that they might be able to escape through the ventilation shafts that lead to various parts of the mine. According to standard safety regulations, there should be ladders that can be used to climb through those shafts. To investigate this, a small group breaks off. But when they get there, they discover a heartbreaking sight. There's no ladder in the shaft. The owners of the mine never finished installing them. Back at the surface, the dust cloud has begun pouring out of the entrance. As the supervisors realize that something must have gone terribly wrong, one man who at the time of the collapse was driving up the ramp is able to make it out through the blinding ash of dust. With the supervisors present, one would expect immediate help would be organized. However, they decide that there is nothing they can do until the dust fully settles. Hours pass until they begin their descent down the ramp where they encountered the blockage. Standing face to face with the enormity of the diorite block completely obstructing the ramp, the supervisors realize that there is no coming through. And still, precious time is lost in the next steps. Despite having a phone line at the mine for emergencies such as this, the mine's owners decide to instead head back towards the closest town in order to get cell service to call for help. Finally, after more than 5 hours since the collapse, authorities are called. The news gets passed from the local fire department and onward until it eventually reaches the disaster office of Chile's Ministry of the Interior. The government deploys special forces in climbing gear with the hope that they could free the trapped miners. The idea is the same one that the miners had in the immediate aftermath, using the ventilation shafts as an escape route. As these forces climb down the shafts, secured to ropes, they are alarmed to see cracks in the walls of the shaft, a result of the diorite block pushing against the walls and squeezing the shafts. Despite the danger of another collapse, the rescuers continue on, determined to reach any man trapped below. They're able to make it to level 268 before they face a pile of rock and debris that looks as if it could fall on top of them at any moment. These shafts are way too unstable, and as they begin to retreat back, suddenly the rocks begin to fall around them, proving that their worries are justified. The rescuers manage to make it out of the ventilation shafts and back to safety. But now they need to report to those waiting anxiously on the surface that a rescue like this will be impossible. The only option left will be to drill. 2,300 feet beneath the rescuers delivering the bad news, the workers who returned from their own failed attempt at navigating the ventilation shafts must also return to the refuge, with bad news of their own. As experienced miners, many realize that this is going to take days, if not weeks. The enormity of what has happened hits some harder than others, and it particularly affects Shift Supervisor Urzura. Urzura makes an announcement that beginning with this moment he is no longer the boss and that they will need to treat each other as equals. Knowing they are going to be trapped for long, the miners next take inventory of the supplies in the refuge, and the workers are soon met with another heartbreak. What was supposed to be enough food to feed an entire shift of workers for 2 days turned out to be 1 can of salmon, 1 can of peaches, 1 can of peas, 18 cans of tuna, 93 packages of cookies, 24 liters of condensed milk, 8 of them expired, 10 bottles of water, and some medicine, also expired. All of this will need to be shared among 33 men and has to last potentially for weeks. Looking at the meager food reserves, the men come up with a plan to make it last as long as possible. Every miner will get 1 meal a day, consisting of 1 cookie, and 1 spoonful of tuna mixed with water that has been heated to turn it into a broth. It is a meal that has less than 300 calories, but it is all they can do. Drinking water, fortunately, is less of an issue. Even though they only have 10 bottles of clean, fresh water, there are large tanks nearby filled with thousands of liters of industrial water that is used to keep the engines of their machines cool. This water is drinkable, even though it isn't exactly desirable as it is contaminated with oil. With a somewhat stable plan for food and water set, a new constant threat begins to materialize. Mental collapse. Would anyone even be searching for them? Or would they just be presumed dead and the mine be sealed off? To keep these shadows at bay, one of the workers, an electrician, figures out a way to keep their flashlights charged. He does so by wiring them up to the large batteries of the work vehicles. And the miners even decide to use the artificial light to simulate night and day, keeping track of time and maintaining a comforting sleep rhythm for themselves. But the light isn't enough to fend off the shadows of the mind, and so the pastor decides to step in. Jose Enriquez isn't actually a pastor by trade, but he is a devout evangelical man. The workers soon call him Pastor, a nickname that he earns because he leads the man in prayer. These prayer sessions become a fixture in the man's cycle. Have a restless sleep throughout the night plagued by nightmares, wake up to the artificial sun that is their flashlights, join together for a sermon delivered by Pastor Enriquez, and then eat a single meal of 1 cookie and broth made from oily water. And most of all, simply wait, never knowing if anyone is even bothering to search for them. Though completely separated from the society above, the miners created their own functioning society underground, from pastor to doctor, and although he had formally stepped down, Ursula still was seen by many as some form of leader. You could think of it as a city below ground. And just like there was a city below, above ground, a new city also started forming. Many of the miners' families were frustrated by the lack of communication, and news reports offered confusing and conflicting information. Therefore, many wives and parents and children decided to head to the mine directly. One of the miners' sisters, Maria Segovia, immediately begins to take charge on behalf of other family members in demanding to know what is going to be done to rescue the miners. She declares that the families will camp outside of the mine until their loved ones are returned to them, and others follow her. Tents are brought out, and the families begin to sleep every night at the site. And every day, Segovia once again demands to know what is happening, until she and the other family members are pushed back and a perimeter is set up around the rescue site, with only authorized personnel allowed to enter. Not to be deterred, Segovia leads efforts to get more information by banging pots and pans at the edge of the perimeter, until an official comes over to let them know the progress. And with every passing day, the tents continue to grow into essentially a new city, and its residents decide to give it a name: Camp Hope. Meanwhile, Segovia also earns herself a nickname: La Alcaldesa, the mayor of Camp Hope. Without knowing about the formation of Camp Hope above them, by the time the third day underground comes about, the workers are increasingly worried. That is, until someone hears a faint sound in the distance. Everyone quiets and they listen together, scarcely able to believe it. It is the sound of a drill traveling through the mountain. Up above, a rotary drill has started its work creating a borehole down to an area close to the refuge, where rescuers correctly believe the workers to be. But there are some issues. The simplest method would be to drill straight down to their target. However, this would mean setting up the massive drilling rig right above the cavity left behind by the giant diorite block that has broken off. And because of that cavity, the ground is too unstable here. Therefore, the drill has to be set up at a different location, and the hole will need to be dug at a 78-degree angle. Their target is a small area, 32 feet wide, and they will need to travel through over 2,000 feet of diorite to reach it. If the drill deviates just by a small amount, by the time they reach the target, they could be completely off. It is at this point during the rescue that yet another person joins the operation. Andrés Sugaret works as an administrator and engineer for the El Teniente mine in Chile. This mine is significantly larger than the San Jose mine, and rescues are much more common there, which makes Sugaret an expert in these situations. Once he arrives, Sugaret immediately gets to work taking over and scaling up the rescue operation. He deploys 8 additional drills, all of them to run concurrently, each making its own borehole with the same target near the refuge. He knows they need to work fast, and the more opportunities they have to hit the target, the better. While the drills continue, Sugaret decides to simultaneously revisit the idea of using the ventilation shafts. He sends climbers back into the mine with the goal to clear these shafts. And as the rescuers get to work on this plan, they soon make a scary observation. They realize that the diorite block is actually still moving, slowly sinking lower and lower into the mine. It could completely collapse at any moment, and a difficult decision is made. The entrance of the San Jose mine needs to be closed and sealed off permanently, and they will need to put all of their hopes into the drills. And as if closing the mine wasn't bad news enough, the drilling is not going according to plan. After 3 days of digging, one of the drills is bending in the wrong direction. With no way to fix it, this hole will need to be given up on and restarted at a different location. And it's seeming more and more likely to rescuers that the workers down below would surely have perished by this point. The drills continue on, with few believing they will reach anything, when suddenly the unthinkable happens. The drill has broken into a cavern in the mine. The loud drilling is stopped, and the rescuers think that they can hear a tapping sound on the drill. Scarcely able to believe it, they quickly bring up the drill in order to lower a camera instead. And once that is lowered, they turn the camera around the cavern, capturing the walls. But unfortunately, they see nothing but emptiness. With sunken hearts, they raise their camera back up. The tapping sound could have been anything, and they go back to drilling. Down below in the refuge, the workers are in a rough shape. It has been over 2 weeks since they've been trapped, and in order to survive longer, they now only eat every second day. They can see the weight loss on each other, and with now noticeably less energy, it is harder to keep moving. Some of the workers even venture down lower into the depths of the mine to see if the drill will break through somewhere there, but they realize it is too dangerous and head back up. Back on the surface, after so many failures, Sugaret has decided on a risky new approach. Instead of digging as fast as they can to reach the workers, they will now go painstakingly slow, sacrificing speed for better accuracy. It will take more days to reach their target, but if they keep missing, it'll take even longer anyway. The drills grind to half of their original speed. Days pass with this new slower approach, and by August 22nd, it has now been 17 days since the collapse. Many have privately given up hope, but none dare to voice their thoughts that it seems unlikely they will find anyone alive at this point. And then, it happens again. One of the drills reaches an open cavern near the target area, and once again, the rescuers think they hear tapping on the drill. Not wanting to have a repeat of last time, they brace themselves to avoid getting their hopes up. Once again, they sent the camera back down. And this time, something peculiar happens. Once the drill reaches the surface, someone points out that there is a small palm-sized red smudge on the drill. Was that there earlier? Before they can investigate further, someone else notices that there is something attached to the drill bit. Tied to it with rubber tubing, there are pieces of paper. There's no mistaking this. Someone down below must have attached this. Carefully unwrapping the tubing, rescuers begin to read the 3 pieces of paper. The first is a note that points out where exactly the drill has broken through. The second is a personal letter to a family member. And the third is the one that completely changes everything. It says, "We are well in the refuge, the 33. Cheers ring out among the rescuers, as 17 days after first hearing news that their family members were killed by an accident in the mine, Maria Segovia and everyone else in Camp Hope hear the news that they have been all found, alive and well.
Euphoria in Chile as 33 miners are found alive in a collapsed mine.
It took 17 days to find the 33 miners.
Trucks carrying mining equipment are cheered like heroes in a parade.
But this is where the real work just begins. Now that the workers have been found, it's time to make first contact with them and figure out how to actually get them out. A camera and a makeshift phone is lowered down to the borehole, and the president of Chile, Sebastián Piñera, is there to speak with Urzúa, who confirms once more that they are all alive and uninjured. The most important first step is to get the man stabilized. 2 additional boreholes are created to serve as a lifeline to the trapped workers. The first initial hole is used to send down supplies. The second hole is used for communication. And the third hole is intended to be used for later as a potential point of rescue to get the man out. And to the dismay of the miners, the first shipment of supplies isn't food but rather bottles of glucose gel. Since they haven't had a proper meal in 18 days, the miners can't jump straight into real food or it will make them sick. They are happy to at least receive fresh water though, meaning they no longer need to drink from the industrial tank full of oil. The 33 miners also receive a shipment of medicine containing vitamins and vaccinations. Urzúa decides to appoint fellow miner Yoni Barrios as their resident doctor in charge of delivering the injections, and Barrios will routinely take the man's vitals such as blood pressure in order to report back to the medicine team above ground. Meanwhile, Cigarette starts coming up with a plan for how to get them out of the mine. All of the holes so far were narrow, but now they would need to drill a much wider hole which they estimate could take up to 4 months. Time in which the giant diorite block could move further and potentially collapse the mine. To speed the process up, Cigarette decides to once again employ multiple strategies at once, and he comes up with 3 plans. Plan A is to use a drilling rig that is used in mines to create new shafts, called a Strata 950. It will first need to drill a pilot hole to reach its target, and then drill the same hole to widen it enough that the man can be raised through. Plan B is to use an air core drill that typically drills wells, called a Schramm 2130 XD. This one will use one of the 3 boreholes already created as its pilot hole, and work to widen it first to 12 inches and then widen it once again to 28 inches. Plan C is to use a powerful oil drilling rig called a Rig 421 that won't need a pilot hole and can theoretically dig the required width in just one single pass. The entire operation would become known as Operation San Lorenzo, named after the patron saint of mining. While all 3 drills are busy digging, another team begins working on the capsules that the workers will need to enter in order to be hoisted up to the surface. To achieve this, officials from NASA are called in to provide advice to the Chilean Navy for constructing the capsule. And in total, 3 of these Phoenix rescue capsules are manufactured. Meanwhile, Plan C is running into an issue. This is a drill that should be able to create the rescue hole in just one pass. However, because of its massive size, the angle it has to drill, and because of the type of diorite rock it must chew through, it continuously wanders off target and needs to be stopped and recalibrated, significantly slowing its progress. The next issue comes with Plan B. Despite a strong start with significant progress made, reaching nearly half of the depth required in its first widening pass, the drill bit breaks off into the borehole, effectively blocking further progress and making the hole useless. And to make matters even worse, Plan A runs into issues with its hydraulics, causing its drilling to also come to a halt. The sounds of the drill stopping sends panic and anxiety through the man trapped below, as it becomes more realistic that their rescue really may not come for several more months. Most of the miners' hopes were pinned on Plan B, and so rather than giving up on the borehole and starting all over again, the engineers came up with a different idea. They devise a special metal contraption that is lowered into the hole and is able to retrieve the broken bit. And surprisingly, it works. With the path cleared, drilling for Plan B can resume. News that come as a relief to everyone.
Hoy es el día, today is the day. As we speak, rescue teams are continuing to test an empty capsule to make sure that it's safe enough for the miners when they make the journey up.
They'll be told to keep their hands in and their faces back as that door closes.
Finally, after 65 days of being trapped underground, what everyone has been so eagerly waiting for happens. The Plan B drill finishes widening its borehole enough that the team can lower the Phoenix capsules through, and the rescue operation can enter its final phase. First, a rescuer is lowered down into the borehole in order to assist the man from the bottom with instructions on how to enter the capsule and make sure they are properly secured. And when this rescuer reaches the bottom and steps out of the capsule, the 33 workers finally get their first sight of someone other than themselves. Someone from up above. And now it's time to start sending the man up, one by one. The order in which the man will go up has already been determined, and first up is the shift's foreman, Florencio Avalos. He and the three men who will follow after him are deemed the most fit, and so if something goes wrong, they will be most likely to be able to extract themselves from the capsule and make their way back down the borehole. As Avalos begins his ascent up towards freedom, he begins to feel cool air the closer he gets to the surface. The entire journey takes about 15 minutes, and as his head pokes above ground, he catches a glimpse of a crowd of people in hard hats breaking out in cheers of joy and celebration. Up there, he is reunited with his family and greeted by the rescue crew, as well as by the Chilean president. After Avalos is successfully extracted, the next 3 fit workers are brought up, followed by those deemed most at risk.
Joy for the rescued miners and pride for an entire country.
It's the greatest underground rescue the world has ever seen.
Each cycle is faster than predicted, and though the rescue started at night, as the morning sun begins to rise, the remaining men are instructed to wear sunglasses in order to protect their eyes from the harsh sunlight after being underground for over 2 months. Finally, it comes time for the last worker to be raised up to the surface, Shift Supervisor Urzura. And cheers continue to ring out as he takes his turn to step outside of the capsule. Next, he declares to President Piñera that, as the boss, he is now handing the shift over. All that's left of the rescue now is to bring up the rescuers who is sent down to aid in the operation, and to send the miners off to the hospital. All things considered, the workers are in great physical shape. All but 2 of the workers are released almost immediately, with one man needing further psychological tests and the other requiring some dental work. After only a few more days, the last 2 men have been released as well, and all men are able to return home, where in most cases they would find themselves bombarded by journalists.
The rumors are proven to be true. There has been an agreement between the 33 miners that there are some things that could perhaps remain untold.
While they were trapped in the mine, the 33 had decided to make a pact. Should they be rescued, they will stand together as a unit and only talk to one person that they all agree upon as to how they survived. This way, no one man would profit off the story any more than the others. However, because of this pact, once the 33 were rescued, the universal support for the man trapped in a mine began to crumble. They did not speak with the journalists that continuously showed up at their door, and they refused to answer questions about what exactly happened in those 17 days before they were found. Almost as if in retaliation, the media began to fill in the gaps with their own stories about the man. And none were as apparent as the one that spread like wildfire about the miner who once acted as the resident doctor, Yanni Barrios. The story ran that he had cheated, and that his wife and his secret girlfriend first learned about each other at Camp Hope because of the accident. In reality, Chile, with a very Catholic population, had only just legalized divorce about 5 years prior. And because of how new the idea of divorce still was, many couples still legally remained married, just separated. Barrios' wife and girlfriend had known about each other for long before the accident, and Barrios himself mainly lived with his girlfriend. Yet, once journalists saw that Barrios had a girlfriend and a wife waiting for him in Camp Hope, before looking any further, they published the story of the 2-timing miner. Many stories were also published that painted the workers as freeloaders, just looking for a get-rich-quick moment because of their ordeal. A wealthy businessman donated 5 million Chilean pesos to each man, equal to about $10,000, and some of the men traveled the world to appear on talk shows and meet celebrities. Stories were published that the workers were racking up gifts and expensive trips. And yet in reality, any actual help or compensation for their ordeal was nowhere to be found. Not even within the legal system of Chile. After a 3-year investigation, no charges were ever brought against the owners of the San Jose mine. The $10,000 they received dried up and they needed to get back to work, with some of the men even choosing to go back to mining because that is what they knew. The story of the Chilean miners is undoubtedly inspiring, but it is also a story about how media attention works. If it weren't for Maria Segovia creating noise, the world might have never noticed this story. And as much as the world cared about the men when they were trapped down below, once they were up, the happy ending story was completed, and these men were forgotten. The Chilean miner rescue is a powerful story of human perseverance. And perseverance can come in many forms. Sometimes it can begin with a simple choice. The choice to risk everything for a chance at something better. Such as in my video about the incredible balloon escape. Back when Germany was a divided country with a brutal border strip that made it impossible to flee from the East German dictatorship, 2 families came up with an insane idea. On June 23, 2018, the boys of the Wild Boys Football Club set out for training as usual. They were a football team of 11 to 16-year-old boys with a coach and an assistant coach. Training went on as usual, and the head coach said goodbye to his players and got ready for the older team's upcoming game, putting his phone to the side. A few hours later, when the coach pulls out his cell phone again, he sees countless missed calls from the boys' parents. The children hadn't shown up at home despite hours having passed. The coach calls his players individually, but none of the children nor the team's assistant coach could be reached. Until one player finally answers the phone. Song Pol, a 13-year-old team member. He's receiving the call from home as he was picked up from training by his mother. But he tells the coach that the other team members rode their bicycles to the nearby Tham Luang caves in order to explore them together with their assistant coach. The coach heads straight to the caves, but when he gets there, he makes a terrifying discovery. At the cave entrance, the coach finds the kids' abandoned bicycles, which means that the team is still inside the cave. Only now, a rapid stream of water flows through the cave entrance, creating a life-threatening situation. The heavy rain had started just when the boys were inside, and if they are still alive, they are now trapped. Thai police officers find backpacks and other items left behind by the boys. However, apart from the cave entrance, it was not possible to search deeper inside, as the water level was so high that it blocked further access.
ตั้งแต่เมื่อวานนะครับท่านผู้ชมครับตอนเย็นๆทั้ง13คนหายตัวไปหลังจากเข้าไปเที่ยวในถ้ำหลวงขุนน้ำนางนอน
In addition to local authorities, special divers from the Thai Navy SEALs are called to the Chiang Rai region, where a crisis management team is set up to coordinate a rescue of the team. Also, a British civilian approaches Thai authorities, offering his help. The man's name is Vern Unsworth, an experienced caver who lives in the area and has a good understanding of the Tham Luang cave system, having been the one who has been exploring and mapping this cave for years. Tham Luang is said to be the 4th longest cave in Thailand, and just over a kilometer past the entrance, this cave splits into 2 paths at a T-section. From here, the entire cave extends over 10 kilometers deep, and the kids, if they were still alive, would most likely be further inside on a higher elevated section. The fact that Unsworth was there was a stroke of luck. He connected Thai authorities with the British Cave Rescue Council and enabled cave divers John Valanton and Rick Stanton to fly in and join the search efforts. John and Rick were longtime dive buddies with a great deal of trust between them, as they have performed a large number of rescue and body recovery missions together.
Out of the breaking news overseas,
12 players and their coach missing.
We don't know how far they have gone.
With new experts arriving every day, there are growing fears that it might already be too late before specialized cave divers can really get started. If the boys were still alive, they would probably have run out of food. After all, they had only planned to spend about an hour in the cave. Meanwhile, heavy rainfall leads to rising water levels inside the cave, and instead of progress, the Thai Navy SEALs were now even less able to advance inside. And when the British cave divers showed up, there was a certain skepticism as to what these older men could contribute that Navy SEALs couldn't.
As far as I know, there's no theatre of war inside a cave, so they've never ever been in a cave in their lives. So of course they haven't got those sort of spatial skills to navigating one, which we've honed over all those years.
For John, cave diving is a passion, and yet also a hobby. Full-time, he works as an IT consultant, and Rick Stanton is a former firefighter. But while the two civilians lack athletic or military understanding, they have a special skill set that is perfectly suited for the conditions here. Although they are only civilians, they are the absolute experts when it comes to cave diving. And getting through the cave here requires many different skills, because while large parts are flooded, there are also passages where you can walk through the cave. And at other places, some climbing is necessary.
Tamloang had very poor visibility, so in lots of places you literally couldn't see your hand in front of your face and you had to almost feel your way along. Sometimes I just headed into the current because I simply couldn't see where I was going. I couldn't see any walls and so on.
Rick and John are working their way through the deep cave system step by step, placing guidelines along the way. This first dive through the cave is particularly challenging because they have to swim against the water current.
There was a really strong current. You probably couldn't swim against it for a long distance, so we were on the floor with our hands in the sand, pulling ourselves along. That was the only way to make progress.
Once Rick and John placed guidelines in a section, other divers could partially pull themselves along, and orientation was made a lot easier, though still a challenge. The diver's target is a section called Pattaya Beach, which is a large chamber that is located at higher elevation and could offer protection from the floodwaters. Perhaps this is where the boys went. But before advancing this far, John and Rick have to interrupt their search. The rain kept getting heavier, and as they thought, this might ultimately determine the fate of the boys. Considering the conditions, Rick and John have to pause their dives. Nonetheless, no thought was given to surrender amidst the Thai Navy SEALs who were working around the clock to do anything that would help reduce the water levels. In addition, countless volunteers are joining the search, such as Saman Kunan, a former Navy SEAL himself, and an experienced diver who joined their help. The SEALs set up a permanent camp inside the cave at Chamber 3. This larger cavern provided enough unflooded space to permanently station equipment, air tanks, and divers. Even amidst a bleak situation, they tried everything they could to divert rivers, find new cave entrances, and use pumping stations to force as much water out of the cave as possible.
No sign of life from 12 boys and their soccer coach.
The boys have now been missing for 72 hours. Locals are holding out hope that they're still alive.
Driven by the enthusiasm of the local search teams and considering the slightly improved weather situation, the British volunteers began to join the help again, embarking on their longest dive into the cave system so far, with the goal of finally reaching Pattaya Beach. After a long and exhausting dive, they finally make it and are now at the highest point of the cave system. But still, there is no sign of the boys. From here on, there is no way of continuing to dive responsibly. The basic rule is to use about a third of the air for the way in, so that you have another third left for the way back, and 1/3 as your reserve. The divers were already way past that rule. But they decided to not give up just yet, and advance further into the cave system, laying guide wire throughout. They continue making their way more than twice as far from the T section as their initial destination, Pattaya Beach, when they eventually swim up to the water's surface and suddenly notice a light. As John swims towards the light and starts hearing voices, he turns on his camera.
Yeah, best you can. How many of you? 13. Brilliant. It's okay. Many people are coming. Many people. We are the first. Many people come.
What day?
Tomorrow. No. What day is it? No, asking. Monday. Okay, but 1 week and Monday. You have been here 10 days. 10 days. You are very strong.
Just describe the media interest in this story.
It's huge here.
태국 현지에서 그 구조 장면 함께 보셨을 것 같은데요.
Es lunes y que han sido muy fuertes por subsistencia.
Leben gefunden worden.
Allora andiamo proprio in
To find the boys there is a huge relief for the authorities and just for the nation in general, actually.
The following day, 3 Thai Navy SEALs dived to the team to stay with them for the remaining time. As enthusiastic as the world reacted to the boys being found, those involved in the rescue knew that finding the boys is the easy part. But no one had any idea how to get them out of the cave.
So the plan for now is this. They are trying to furiously pump as much water out of this cave as possible.
Elon Musk built a kid-sized submarine after the rescue team rejected his offer, claiming that a rigid craft couldn't negotiate the sinuous cave tunnels. The Tesla boss lashed out on Twitter.
In previous cave rescues, drilling has been used as a way to get people out.
And the final option is to leave the group inside the cave until around mid-October, when the monsoon season finally ends.
On one hand, there was the option to teach the boys how to dive. They could practice short dives with instructors in their cave until they are ready to take on the long, difficult journey out. Option 2 was to rescue the team using an emergency elevator in a newly drilled shaft, somewhat similar to the 2010 rescue of miners in Chile. Finally, there was also the option to simply wait until the rainy season is over. As long as they are trapped, the team would be provided with food and would be able to walk out of the cave once the water level went down. While to outsiders it appeared as though there are many difficult options to choose from, the rescuers on site came to the realization that it was even worse, that none of these options was realistic. Teaching the kids to dive in this extreme environment is not possible. Not only are some of the boys unable to swim, they are also exhausted and tired from days of no proper sleep. In addition, the path through the narrow, dark cave has nothing to do with recreational scuba diving, and a panic attack would mean certain death. Drilling a shaft was also completely unrealistic. In the case of the miners in Chile, it took about 7 weeks after their discovery before they could be freed. The situation in the Thai cave was not much better. The team was almost a kilometer underground, and in between there was mostly solid rock that is difficult to drill through. And even if this approach was used, it's unclear how to exactly determine the location of the boys so that the borehole perfectly lines up with their chamber. Lastly, waiting until the end of rainy season is also doomed to fail. The oxygen level in the chamber is already in a dangerous range that is not survivable for a sustained time. And it was still only the beginning of the rainy season, which lasts until November. The team might have had to hold out for more than 4 months, during which increasing rain could endanger the safe spot they were in. The rescuers were out of options. On top of that, word of a tragic new development made rounds.
Waking up to this news this morning, the man who died was young, he was fit, he was a former Navy SEAL, and I think it really just underlines how dangerous this cave is.
Saman Kunan, the retired Navy SEAL who volunteered to help, had died. A painful loss and a reminder of just how dangerous this entire operation is.
Saman Kunan died from lack of oxygen, his dive partner finding him unconscious in the water.
With no realistic rescue plan available, a somewhat insane idea is thrown into the room. What if the children were sedated and then transported through the cave system while being unconscious? At this point, Rick Stanton gets in touch with an old acquaintance, Dr. Richard Harris. Harris is an anesthesiologist from Australia and a cave diver with over 30 years of experience. Harris is averse to the plan and considers sedating the boys far too dangerous, with low chances of survival. Still, he travels to Thailand. And what ultimately convinces him is not a change of his risk assessment, but the realization that there's simply no better option. To do this, a team was assembled and flown in, made up of some of the best cave divers in the world. The kids in the cave would put on a wetsuit and then be given 2 shots of sedative drugs, leaving them fully unconscious. Then, a special diving mask is put on that covers the entire face and supplies positive pressure so that even if a gap opens underwater, the air pressure should keep the water out. The boys' hands were tied behind their back to keep their arms from swinging around. And a tank filled with 80% oxygen was placed in front of the boys' chests so that their head cannot fully tilt down, which could result in a blocked airway. The kids would also be tethered to their diver so that they could not get lost. And from this point on, the lives of these kids were literally in these divers' hands.
If anything had happened to the mask that was keeping their face dry, if it had been knocked in any way, then the child would unquestionably have drowned.
For longer intermediate segments in which the cave can be crossed on foot, the boys were taken onto a stretcher and transported towards the next diving segment. The drugs given to the kids are not enough for the whole journey, and the diver has to administer a new drug to the child with a pre-made syringe. Throughout the entire way, the divers fear for the kids' lives. But when the first 2 kids make it safely to chamber 3, confidence grows. It appears as though this insane plan is actually working. From here on out, the water had at this point successfully been drained, and the Navy SEALs, together with countless volunteers, transported the boys in stretchers through the remaining rocky terrain.
Reports from northern Thailand say at least 4 boys have been brought out.
We've got live pictures here. You can see the helicopter blades. And
ambulances.
Yes, ambulances, we saw those.
On the first day, 4 boys were successfully rescued. And the following day, another 4 kids were saved. On the 3rd and last day, the plan was to rescue the last 4 boys and the assistant coach. But as well established as the procedure seemed at this time, something suddenly didn't work. The last boy was the smallest of them all, and the positive pressure mask didn't fit his small face. No matter how tight the divers pressed the mask against the face, it didn't form a watertight seal. The divers were forced to try another mask, which they had taken with them but had hoped that they would never need it. It is a small children's mask, more suited for recreational use. And even this one barely fits the face and keeps slipping off. But the divers secure it as good as possible, and then hope for the best.
Extraordinary moment here as we are now learning that entire team is now free of that cave.
The rescue operation was tense until the very last second, but now it was done. All the children and the assistant coach were saved, a success greater than even the divers had expected. Although not without a prize. A Thai Navy SEAL contracted a blood infection during the rescue operation. Bairud Pakbara was a petty officer first class who had struggled with health problems ever since the operation. 1 year after the rescue, he passed away. With that, 2 Thai Navy SEALs gave their lives to save the football team. They represent the relentless effort that these Thai Navy SEALs put into the mission. And despite some skepticism on both sides at the beginning, the British divers and the Thai Navy SEALs ultimately complemented each other ideally, and were able to proceed strategically and efficiently. A success story that was watched around the world.
You're heroes now. Did you feel that?
If you could do something for somebody else's child, I'm sure you would too. We just had a peculiar set of skills that were appropriate in that moment.
Please welcome the Wild Boars soccer team.
This was a story that I've been meaning to tell for a while, and I'm glad that I finally got to put it on YouTube. But there are a couple of things that aren't ideal. For videos to be able to make ad money on YouTube, they have to be advertiser friendly, which was fine with this topic, but is just not the case with certain subject matters. One of my favorite videos I've made is a detailed look at the 2011 raid on the compound.
Good afternoon. We begin with breaking news.
An explosion on an oil drilling platform
in the Gulf of Mexico.
On April 20th, 2010, an explosion occurred on the Deepwater Horizon oil platform.
The worst oil spill in U.S. history.
You could see that floating oil slick from space every day.
And what followed was millions of gallons of oil spilling uncontrollably into the ocean.
Well, it is almost unthinkable, isn't it?
This is a battle we're waging against an oil spill that is assaulting our shores and our citizens.
This video tells the story of the race to stop that spill. How engineers tried to plug a hole over 5,000 feet deep underwater. And I wanted to know just how much oil was actually lost in the disaster, and try different methods to better visualize the sheer amount of loss beyond just numbers alone. This is Deepwater Horizon Visualized. To visualize just how much oil was spilled, we first need some sort of measuring container. But ordinary containers won't do. So instead, we will be using the Empire State Building in New York City. Theoretically, it can hold up to 277 million gallons of oil. But to start off, our container is empty, as we look back to the evening of the disaster. On the evening of April 20th, 2010, everything still seems normal on Deepwater Horizon, with workers busy finishing up the borehole. What many may not know is that the Deepwater Horizon rig isn't actually an oil platform designed for extraction. Instead, it is a drilling rig used on new sites. Its job is to create the initial borehole and install a wellhead on the sea floor. And once that is done, it'll move on and another platform will take over for the actual extraction of oil. The well itself is finished. The natural oil and gas reservoir has been reached. And all that's left to do now is create a seal so that Deepwater Horizon can finally leave, so that a smaller, less costly rig can take its place. For this transition, it is important that the well is completely closed off. And so the crew members are carrying out a test to make sure that the well is ready to be temporarily abandoned for the transition between rigs. But all of a sudden, the crew notices a huge spike in pressure readings. This is bad because it usually indicates that oil and gas has unexpectedly entered the well. The crew then runs the same pressure test again, but it is the same result. This is especially bad news for oil giant BP, considering it costs them more than $1 million a day to operate the rig. And at this point, Deepwater Horizon is already more than 6 weeks behind schedule to move to its next location. Economic pressures that may have resulted in a culture of negligence. Despite the alarming pressure readings, The crew decides to carry on. And then, just before 10 p.m., those still awake on board of Deepwater Horizon are shocked when a geyser of mud and seawater begins gushing out of the well and showering the rig. Before anyone can grasp what is even happening, the worst-case scenario occurs. Oil and gas escapes from the wellhead and rushes up to the platform, where the gas explodes.
We're looking at new pictures from the scene. The Coast Guard says the explosion happened around 10 o'clock last night.
There's a desperate search in the Gulf of Mexico
for 11 people who were on a drilling platform when it exploded.
Of the 126 personnel initially on board of Deepwater Horizon, 115 are rescued, but 11 men are missing.
The rig is still burning out of control.
We have covered approximately 1,940 square miles of search area.
A desperate search is carried out for the missing men. But as the evening rolls over into the next day and the sun begins to rise, it isn't looking good. By day 3 of scouring the Gulf and still no sign of them, the search is called off. Tragically, all 11 men were presumed to be near the blast and were unable to escape in time. The fate of Deepwater Horizon is looking just as grim. Emergency responders attempt to put out the blaze, but this is made complicated by its remote location in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as oil from the well continually fueling the fire.
It was, you cannot imagine how enormous this rig is anyway. It's the size of 2 or 3 football fields.
There is little anyone can realistically do, and any attempt to douse the enormous fire is in vain. And while creaking and groaning, the rig finally begins to tilt into the Gulf. After 2 days of burning, it only takes minutes for Deepwater Horizon to slip beneath the water's surface and sink to the bottom of the sea. The fires come to an end, and yet it doesn't mark the end of the disaster. In fact, this was still just the beginning, because deep down below, the well Deepwater Horizon had drilled is now leaking into the Gulf, starting to fill our measuring container with oil. Initially, BP reported that no oil was escaping into the sea, but this was corrected just a few days later when a new report came out that there was indeed a leak. As the extent of the spill became more apparent, BP began feeling the immense pressure to close the leak as soon as possible, and their first order of business is to send a remote-operated vehicle down to the well itself. This vehicle should provide answers and help them figure out where exactly the oil is leaking from. Every well drilled has a very large complex structure installed on the seafloor called a blowout preventer, or BOP for short. The drill pipe from the rig to the well must run through the BOP, which is a safeguard to prevent uncontrolled oil and gas from traveling up the drill pipe and to the rig. Essentially, the BOP is there to prevent exactly what happened here, a blowout. To do so, the BOP has 2 systems that can be used to close a well. Pipe rams, which are heavy metal blocks that can clamp together to stop the flow, and annular preventers that close the pipe using a rubber seal. And on the day of the accident, crew members on the Deepwater Horizon platform did actually deploy both systems within the BOP in an effort to close the well. However, because these systems were activated too late, they didn't work as intended. Oil and gas had already entered the pipe above the BOP, meaning there was nothing left to stop it from reaching the rig. In theory, this also should have been preventable, as there was one final failsafe within the BOP that should have been engaged to close the well: the blind shear ram. Once activated, the blind shear ram uses a sharp metal blade to cut the pipe and form a seal. Crew members later reported that they tried to activate the blind shear ram after the explosions, but because they had lost power, the switch didn't work. However, this also shouldn't have mattered, as the BOP is designed with a fail-safe mechanism to automatically engage the blind shear ram if it loses connection with the rig, such as in the case of a power outage. Why this didn't work is a mystery to the experts, and something the ROV will study. And once they are able to reach the BOP, a devastating sight is waiting for them. The crew sees that the blind shear ram did engage, but because the pipe had buckled, it did not cut the pipe as it should have. Rather, the ram punctured the pipe, thereby making things even worse and allowing a large volume of oil and gas to escape. Now aware of the full extent of the problem, it was time to come up with a plan. The only guaranteed way to permanently seal the well will be by drilling a completely new borehole that intersects with the existing one. That way, mud and cement can be pumped through the new entrance to seal the leak, eventually choking the flow of oil and gas completely. The crew begins drilling this relief well 12 days after the explosion, and a week later they begin drilling a second one, just in case the first should fail. But this process will take months, and every day until then, the well will still be leaking, causing massive environmental damage, and filling up our container of the Empire State Building. Therefore, experts head to the drawing board to figure out alternative solutions that could lead to a faster result. And they come up with an idea. What if they could simply cover the leak with some sort of dome? A structure like that exists, and it is called the cofferdam, a large steel and concrete structure weighing nearly 100 metric tons. A solution that has never been tried before this deep. The cofferdam is designed with an opening on the side so that it can be lifted over the broken pipe, and on the walls of the cofferdam there are 4 flaps. These are there in case the dam starts sinking into the ocean mud, to prevent it from sinking too low. If everything goes to plan, most of the oil would rush up and flow through a pipe inserted into a smaller opening at the top of the dome, and from there the oil would be directed up to a tanker ship. To turn this plan into reality, crew members are slowly getting to work lowering the cofferdam into the Gulf. But almost immediately, there is a problem. As the cofferdam descends into the colder, high-pressure depths, the gas escaping from the well reacts with the surrounding water and forms methane hydrates, essentially ice crystals that block the opening at the top of the dome. And with the opening frozen off, the oil and gas inside the dome now has nowhere to escape, and therefore the entire cofferdam becomes dangerously buoyant. Almost like a balloon, the oil fills the cofferdam and makes it rush up back towards the surface. The crew members above are now staring down a potential disaster, because as the cofferdam begins rushing up, it is heading straight towards one of the response vessels above. Thankfully, the crew is able to get it back under control, with enough time to direct the cofferdam away from the vessel. Nonetheless, they have to abandon the dam, which eventually sinks back down to the bottom of the ocean, where it will remain abandoned. With this attempt a bust, there's still no time for frustration, and the engineers immediately jump back to the drawing board. They come up with Plan C, the pipe. For this to work, they will attempt to siphon the oil and gas to a tanker, but this time without a cofferdam. Rather, they simply insert a smaller pipe into the broken well pipe. And this method actually works to a degree. The crew is able to start collecting some of the oil in a tank and flare the natural gas overboard by diverting it away from the ship and setting it ablaze. The oil flow is finally slowed down. Our measuring container is filling up slower now, but it is still steadily increasing as oil leaks out around the pipe. And so, experts move on yet again with their next idea. and they come up with their plan for the so-called junk shot. To do this, a very complex procedure is set up underwater near the well, and a new drilling vessel, the Q4000, is positioned above the leak site. Using this vessel's pipe, heavy drilling mud will be pumped into the BOP, along with lots of different junk. This includes anything from golf balls to rubber tires or knotted rope. The idea is to use the weight of the mud and junk to force the oil back down into the well, so that in a second step, cement can be poured on top in order to create a seal.
It's kind of like stopping up a toilet, plug up the blowout preventer, and then at that point, once we get it plugged up, we can actually pump heavy fluids down the well and hopefully stop it from flowing and then pump cement after that.
With fingers crossed, crew members start the process. Mud and junk are shot into the damaged well, and using underwater cameras, crew members monitor the situation. But yet again, nothing goes to plan, as they watch the junk get spewed right back out. The pressure from the well is simply too high, meaning any material dumped on top is simply displaced by the gushing oil. The crew attempts the junk shot several more times, but it is a futile effort. And experts warn that if they continue trying, it could lead to instability in the well, causing what's known as an underwater blowout. This would mean that oil may begin escaping not just from the well, but also from many points throughout the surrounding seafloor. If this happens, containment will be virtually impossible, and so they abandon the junk shot idea. And suddenly, it's back to square one yet again.
Cleanup is costing $6 million a day, and when it's all over, the price will be over $1 billion.
With the initial boreholes from Plan A still far from reaching their destination, the engineers decide to revisit the idea of a containment dome. Even though it didn't work with the original large cofferdam, this time they decide to go for a much smaller, better-fitting cap that could be installed directly onto the BOP. Rather than encasing the entire area with a large dome, they could direct the oil flow straight through this cap. But there is one issue. In order to do this, they will need to cut the damaged pipe that is still connected to the BOP. Up until this point, the kinks in the pipe have been helping to actually slow the rate of oil that is leaking out, and if it is cut off, the rate of oil escaping will likely increase by as much as 20%. It is an extremely risky move. If this cap doesn't work, then they will have made the situation worse for nothing, but they have to try. The decision is made to cut the damaged pipe off from the BOP. Oil starts rushing out at a faster pace than ever before, and the clock is ticking. It takes several days to situate the new smaller cap on top of the BOP. Having learned from the freezing issues with the previous cofferdam, this time warm water is pumped down to hopefully prevent the formation of ice crystals. And as engineers watch the underwater vehicles at work, everyone holds their breath. And then, with the cap in place, the oil starts to flow, and everyone sighs with relief as it actually works. The cap has created a seal and is collecting a large portion of the oil, sending it up to a collection ship on the surface. In fact, so much oil and gas are collected that several more vessels are added for storage and processing. But the work still isn't done. Even though this is the most progress experts have made in stemming the flow, they still aren't capturing all of the leak. And our container continues to fill, though at a slower rate. Throughout the next month, engineers are able to devise and install a series of better-fitting caps, each one lowering the amount of oil escaping into the sea.
The story today is that they're going to literally put a new cap, a new top, that may not be the right nomenclature, on the well that's been leaking in the Gulf of Mexico for up to weeks and months or whatever.
Until finally, a tight enough cap is installed that is able to completely stop the oil from leaking for the first time in 3 months. 86 days after the initial explosion, the oil finally stops leaking into the ocean. However, tensions are still high, as there is no telling how long the temporary capping can hold for. Luckily though, it does hold for the time it is needed, and eventually the first relief well reaches its destination, intersecting with the original well. Almost immediately, heavy mud and cement are now poured into the bottom of the well, and the news is delivered to the world that the well has officially been successfully and permanently sealed. 110 days after the whole ordeal began. In the end, approximately 134 million gallons of oil were lost in the Gulf of Mexico, filling our container to about 50%. And this is the figure prominently cited across a bunch of articles. And yet, this figure is only a conservative estimate of how much oil was truly spilled. A group of independent scientists and researchers came together with their own assessment, and they measured the flow of oil as seen from videos of the leak and calculated effects from pressure, temperature, geological conditions, and many other factors. And according to their estimate, over 210 million gallons of oil were actually lost in the leak. A massive increase from the official calculation, now filling our container up to about 75%. And this is just the pure crude oil, though it is important to remember that every gallon of oil can coat huge areas of sea surface, as visible by this satellite image taken by NASA, showing the oil-covered sea in the Gulf of Mexico.
We found that the animals that lived in the nearshore environment had lower survival rates. We saw 900 plus dolphins strand or wash ashore, many of them dead.
BP has heavily contested this larger figure, claiming that it doesn't take into account the hundreds of thousands of gallons that were siphoned and collected before it could enter the Gulf's waters. Though it is also important to note that BP has a vested interest in keeping the figure as low as possible. In the end, it is impossible to know the true exact amount of how much oil was lost, but what we do know is that no matter which of the two figures you go with, Deepwater Horizon was the world's largest accidental spill to date, with irreparable damage done to the ecosystem and the loss of life of 11 men who were working on the platform when it exploded. Plugging a hole over 5,000 feet below the ocean was a massive challenge, but it's the kind of high-stakes problem only the best engineers can solve. And for my next video, I focused on a completely different kind of engineering marvel, one that happens much closer to the surface, on a racetrack. As for my upcoming video, I have animated an entire Formula One pit stop in order to understand how it's possible to change
This is Lake Penure, or at least sort of. In 1980, something happened here beneath the surface that would forever and drastically change the lake and the surrounding area. It would also be one of the most violent and destructive phenomena to have ever occurred. As always, viewer discretion is advised. The sun had yet to rise in the morning of November 20th, 1980, but the air inside Jefferson Island salt mine was filled with the smell of machinery and damp salt. Dim lights flickered along the tunnels of the vast cavernous chambers that had been carved from the earth. And it was just another morning for Junius Gaddison, the mine's master electrician, as he worked on the 1,300-foot level, gathering electrical supplies from the storeroom. Junius was no stranger to life underground. The mine operated around the clock, 7 days a week, and he had spent years working in the mine deep beneath Lake Penure, surrounded by massive walls of basically pure salt. It was a routine job for him, but even the most unremarkable tasks can be dangerous inside a twisting underground maze of tunnels. Just as he was reaching for a spool of electrical wire, though, something happened. A muffled, unfamiliar sound echoed through the tunnel. It was in the distance, but something about it made him pause. He then set the wire down, listening. Then there was another hollow bang, and then another. These were not the usual sounds of mining he was used to hearing. Obviously, underground work is filled with noise, but the longer a miner works in a mine, the more a miner can tell what sounds normally correspond with the work of the day. This was something beyond normal. It wasn't from distant drilling or the vibration of equipment. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw a thin stream of murky water creeping along the mine floor. He then turned toward the water and saw something even more alarming. Fuel drums, which are usually stacked neatly near the storage area, were moving along the shallow stream. And then it hit him. This could only mean that water, which was not supposed to be there at all, was from the lake above and was pouring into the mine. Without hesitation, he hit the power switch that controlled the lights on the levels below him and flashed the evacuation signal. This communicated to everyone that they needed to get out immediately. Then, grabbing the nearest phone, he shouted into it, calling the hoist operator to lower the mine's only elevator. Somewhere deep below, dozens of men had been working and were now aware that time was running out. Above them, on the lake, something even more horrific was unfolding. For decades leading up to this, Lake Peigneur had been a quiet, unassuming body of water located in southern Louisiana. Spanning about 1,300 acres, it was shallow, barely 10 feet or 3 meters at its deepest, and it was a popular spot for fishing bass and perch. Few who fished or boated on the lake, though, ever thought about what was beneath its surface. And understandably, because they couldn't see the labyrinth of tunnels carved into something known as the Jefferson Island Salt Dome. This geological formation, formed over millions of years, was one of 5 in the region beneath Louisiana that were like buried mountains of pure white salt. Over time, shifting geology had pushed these domes upward, creating these small, isolated landforms that dotted the area. This salt was valuable, so in 1919, the Diamond Crystal Salt Company began mining operations beneath Lake Peigneur using the room and pillar method, which you may be familiar with from other videos on the channel. This style of mining requires leaving behind large natural pillars to act as supports to stabilize the mine, and the Jefferson Island Salt Mine formed underground rooms nearly 100 feet or 30 meters wide and 80 feet or 24 meters tall. Over the years, the mine became an economic powerhouse, employing hundreds of workers across its sprawling network of tunnels. Some of these were as deep as 1,500 feet or 457 meters. There was, however, another force competing for the riches beneath the lake. The same geological shifts that have created these salt domes also made them prime locations for petroleum deposits. Oil companies eventually caught on to this, and they had been drilling near Jefferson Island for years, hoping to tap into the natural reservoirs that often formed around the salt domes. By 1980, Texaco, one of the world's largest oil companies, had secured the rights to drill an exploratory well on Lake Peigneur. Their goal was to determine whether there was oil below, and if so, extract it. The company then hired Wilson Brothers, a contractor, to operate a floating drilling rig just offshore. It was a standard job and one that had been done countless times before, and so neither the Texaco engineers nor the Diamond Crystal miners believed there was any risk of interference between their operations. The mine had its own maps detailing the vast chambers below, and Texaco had surveyed the lakebed before drilling. And yet, somewhere in those calculations, something had gone terribly wrong. As Junius watched water rising in the mine, he didn't know what caused it yet, but on the surface just above him, the Texaco drilling rig was already sinking, and the peaceful lake he had worked beneath for years was about to disappear forever. Above ground, Lake Peigneur was deceptively calm at first. The crew aboard the Texaco platform was focused on their drill, which had become stuck. At 4:30 a.m., while boring into the lakebed, the 14-inch drill bit had suddenly jammed at 1,228 feet or 374 meters. This wasn't entirely unusual. Drilling through compacted sediment and geological formations often led to snags. The crew then attempted these standard fixes like moving the pipe, rotating it, and applying pressure, but nothing worked. By 5:45 a.m., the next crew arrived to take over, and as they ran through the routine troubleshooting process, a few workers began to hear something strange. There were a series of faint popping sounds from deep beneath the earth. Then at 6:30 a.m., the drilling platform tilted slightly. The shift was barely noticeable at first, but the rig was no longer level. Some of the workers then wondered aloud whether the lakebed was unstable, and just in case, they decided to abandon the platform and head for the shore. Then, an hour later at 7:25 a.m., the rig suddenly lurched hard to one side. Metal groaned, cables snapped, and the entire structure began to collapse. The crew could only watch in disbelief as the drilling rig sank into the lake, disappearing into what should have only been 10 feet of water. This seemed impossible. The drilling rig was taller than the water was deep, yet despite this fact, it completely vanished below the water. Then, the lake itself began to move. The water directly above the drilling site swirled, forming a dark whirlpool. The current then accelerated, growing stronger by the second, and soon it was like the surface of the lake was collapsing inward, as if a bathtub plug had just been pulled from a drain. It didn't take long for people to realize this was no ordinary drilling accident. The Texaco crew, now safely on shore, could only stare in stunned horror. A suction force stronger than anything they'd ever seen before began dragging objects towards the center of the growing vortex. In fact, 11 supply barges moored nearby were pulled in one by one into the spiraling whirlpool. The most terrifying consequences, however, were still unseen. Beneath the surface, inside the salt mine, 55 men were still underground, and the water was coming for them. In the depths of the Jefferson Island salt mine, the sense of urgency was growing. After Junius had triggered the evacuation signal, the underground tunnels were in confused chaos. Word spread fast, but the miners still didn't really know what was going on. The 1,500-foot level of the mine, where most men were working, was nearly a quarter-mile below the surface. And down there, conveyor belts carried salt, equipment was loud, and trucks continued moving. Then the phone lines went dead shortly after, and the first of the water arrived. It started as a trickle at first, streaming down the walls and pooling at their feet, but in less than a minute, it was a full-blown torrent of dark, rapidly rising water. On the 1,300-foot level, Junius and his crew were already waist-deep in water as they struggled toward the mine's only elevator. The hoist operator had lowered the cage, but there was no telling how long they had before the tunnels completely collapsed. Meanwhile, back on the 1,500-foot level, Foreman Earl Dundas realized just how dire the situation was. He and a handful of men raced against the rising flood, yelling to their coworkers to drop everything and move, because salt mines, for all their size and depth, were incredibly fragile once compromised. Unlike coal and stone mines, which could sometimes withstand flooding, salt dissolves in water. This meant the pillars that supported the mine were already crumbling, and as more of the lake poured in, the mine was literally melting from the inside out. The only way out was the elevator shaft, and everyone knew it. So in the darkness, boots splashed through knee-high water, and men gripped each other's arms to keep from falling as they navigated through the collapsing tunnels. The deafening roar of rushing water filled the mine, drowning out shouted instructions. Above, the elevator cage arrived at the 1,300-foot level where Junius and his team had been waiting. They then crammed inside, dripping wet and shaking before signaling for the operator to bring them up. The metal cage then lurched upward, carrying them toward the surface as the lower levels began to vanish beneath the flood, but there were still dozens of men below and time was running out. On the 1,500-foot level, Earl and his crew reached the base of the elevator shaft and entered, only to find a small group still running towards them as they ascended. These were the final handful of men who had been working deeper in the tunnels. But instead of leaving them behind, Earl made the split-second decision to turn back and guide them through the rising waters. Above them as well, the hoist operator waited for a final load as the shaft trembled and salt and debris rained down from the collapsing ceiling. Finally, the last group of miners reached the cage. Earl was then the last to step inside and slammed the metal gate shut behind him. The elevator shaft then jerked violently as it made its final ascent. The water had almost reached them, and by the time the cage was halfway up, the 1,500-foot level had completely disappeared, swallowed by the lake. When the final group of miners stepped onto solid ground, drenched and gasping for breath, the hoist operator cut power to the mine because there was nothing left to save below. Back above ground, Lake Penior was no longer a lake. It was a swirling vortex, pulling in everything in its path. What had begun as a small whirlpool above the sunken Texaco drilling rig had now grown to monstrous proportions, dragging in anything near the shoreline. By the time the last miners reached the surface, the land itself was even giving way. Even a tugboat with its engines at full throttle fought desperately to resist the pull, but it was no match for the force of the draining lake. It was dragged back into the vortex and vanished, with its crew escaping to safety just in time. Along the shoreline, even entire sections of Jefferson Island crumbled and were pulled into the growing sinkhole. Trees also tipped over, exposing their roots for only seconds before vanishing into the swirling water. In total, 65 acres of land disappeared into the whirlpool. The destruction was unlike anything the people on shore had ever seen. As the mine continued to collapse beneath the lake, trapped air from the caverns was also forced upward, starting as low, hissing gusts from the mine's air shafts and quickly becoming something more violent. Then suddenly, a geyser erupted, shooting a column of water and debris 400 feet or 122 meters into the air. The force of the explosion apparently rattled windows miles away, and as you might imagine, witnesses could do nothing but watch as everything around them was pulled into the earth, consumed by a force beyond their comprehension. But even after Lake Peigneur had all but vanished, the disaster was far from over, as the Gulf of Mexico soon came rushing in. For as long as anyone could remember, the nearby canal flowed in a single direction, which was out of Lake Peigneur southward toward Vermilion Bay, where it emptied into the Gulf of Mexico. It was a quiet waterway, and again, used mostly by fishermen and small boats traveling between the lake and the bay. But after the sinkhole swallowed the lake, something inexplicable happened. The current first stopped and then began moving the opposite direction. Without warning, the canal reversed course. Instead of flowing outward, it began rushing backward, funneling millions of gallons of salt water from the Gulf straight into the lake bed. And with so much water pouring in at once, the sudden reversal of the canal created an extraordinary sight. In the middle of what used to be the lake, a raging waterfall 50 feet or 15 meters high had formed. And for 2 days, the waterfall continued, sending billions of gallons of seawater flooding into the space where Lake Peigneur used to be. By the time the flow stabilized, the lake had been changed forever. After the sinkhole formed and the Gulf of Mexico came rushing in, everything was different. The lake was now 200 feet or 61 meters deep and claimed the title of the deepest in Louisiana. Its once fresh waters were now saltwater, permanently altering the ecosystem, and fish populations and plant life were devastated. Although the lake refilled, it was not the same place it had been before November 20th, 1980. The event had physically reshaped the landscape, leaving behind a deeper, stranger body of water that stood as a permanent reminder of what had happened there. Finally, in the days following the disaster, the surface of the lake was eerily calm again. The whirlpool had disappeared and the land stopped collapsing, and the geyser had gone silent. But the people who witnessed it would never forget what they'd seen. In the aftermath of the disaster, investigators were left with an unsettling truth. Despite the enormous scale of the destruction, no one could say with absolute certainty how it happened. Normally, after a mining accident or industrial failure, experts could examine the wreckage and reconstruct events to determine exactly what went wrong. At Lake Peigneur, there was nothing left to examine. The Texaco drilling rig, along with all its equipment, was gone. The mine itself had also collapsed and was buried beneath millions of gallons of water. The borehole that had punctured the mine had also widened into an enormous sinkhole, erasing any trace of its original position. So with no physical evidence remaining, investigators only had maps, drilling records, and witness testimonies to piece together what had occurred. 2 theories then emerged as the most likely causes of the disaster. One possibility was that Texaco's drilling crew had miscalculated their coordinates and unknowingly bored directly into the salt mine. Even a small error could have placed their drill far closer to the mine than intended, triggering the catastrophe. The other theory placed the blame on the Diamond Crystal Salt Company, suggesting that the mine's maps had been outdated or inaccurate. If the underground chambers extended farther than expected, then it was possible Texaco had drilled exactly where they had intended to, only to puncture a tunnel that, according to old mine records, should not have been there. In August of 1981, the Mine Safety and Health Administration released its official report on the disaster. Their findings confirmed the sequence of events. Texaco's drill had punctured the salt mine, allowing water to rush in, dissolve in the support pillars, and trigger the collapse. When it came time to assigning blame, however, the report stopped short. With all the physical evidence destroyed in the disaster, there was no way to definitively determine whether the fault lay in Texaco's incorrect drilling location or Diamond Crystal's mine maps. But while the government never placed full responsibility on either party, the financial consequences were unavoidable. Texaco and Wilson Brothers Drilling, the contractor operating the rig, agreed to pay $32 million to Diamond Crystal Salt Company for the destruction of the mine. In addition, Texaco, Wilson Brothers, and Diamond Crystal also paid out $12.8 million to Live Oak Gardens, which was the botanical garden that had lost a significant portion of its land when Jefferson Island collapsed into the whirlpool. The Jefferson Island salt mine would never reopen, but Diamond Crystal continued operations for a few years after the disaster. However, with the entire underground structure permanently compromised, the company finally shut the mine down for good in December of 1986. Even now, more than 4 decades later, the Lake Peigneur disaster remains one of the strangest and most catastrophic industrial accidents in history. Yet the most astonishing fact of all was that no human lives were lost. Against impossible odds, all 55 miners trapped below the lake escaped. Their survival was the result of quick thinking, strict evacuation procedures, and the leadership of men like Junius and Earl, who wasted no time in recognizing the danger and acting on it. Unlike many of the other mine disasters covered in the channel, Diamond Crystal maintained a tight operation that prioritized worker safety. The mine's emergency drills were held every 6 months like clockwork, and every miner inside knew exactly what to do when the evacuation signal was given, avoiding what could have been one of the worst mining tragedies in history. For those who witnessed the disaster firsthand, though, as you might imagine, the memories never faded. The whirlpool, the land collapse, the eerie reversal of the canal, and the 400-foot geyser blasting into the sky seem more like something out of science fiction than real life. Even now, many struggle to believe that a lake actually drained into the earth, pulling in an entire ecosystem with it. The legacy of the disaster lives on in Lake Peñora's new depths, in the lost mine beneath its surface, and in the unanswered questions that still remain. Although legal battles were settled and companies moved on, the lake has never truly recovered. It remains to this day a different lake than the one that existed before the disaster, carrying with it a story unlike any other. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want... This is the Levant Mine, also nicknamed the Mine Under the Sea. It was first opened in 1820 and would eventually reach 2,000 feet deep into the earth, but also a full mile underneath the Atlantic Ocean. I'm sure you can imagine what might happen if one of those tunnels were to fail. Incredibly, that isn't even the worst of the conditions within. This is the story of the Levant mine disaster. As always, viewer discretion is advised. There are a lot of jobs today that are stressful for one reason or another. Some are just exhausting or emotionally draining, but the number of jobs that are truly life-threatening pales in comparison to a couple hundred years ago. While some of the improvements can be credited to new safety technology and better training, the real reason things have gotten much better is legislation. Because no matter how many injuries something might prevent, there's nothing quite like the threat of legal action to get a business to actually pay for safety equipment and mandate its use. Mining in particular has never been an easy job and still isn't. However, it's a lot better with things like electricity, forced airflow, hydraulic motors, and geological tools that can actually test how safe it is to dig somewhere. People working just a couple hundred years ago, though, didn't have access to most or all of those things. One of these mines was known as the Levant Mine and was located on the very far southwestern tip of England. It opened in 1820 and was primarily a copper mine, but also extracted tin and smaller amounts of arsenic. At the time, copper and tin were about to become very important and very lucrative since they could be used to make brass and bronze. But for the people working there, the conditions deep in the mine were nothing short of horrific. Reaching down about 600 meters or 2,000 feet below the earth, the Levant mine was pitch black, scorching hot, and parts of it stretched horizontally a whole mile underneath the Atlantic Ocean. And practically begging fate, one of the mine shafts named 40 Backs was as little as 12 meters or 40 feet from the seabed above. If that tunnel had ever failed, the mine would have filled with water too quickly for anyone on the lower levels to escape. But even without the threat of suddenly drowning quite literally looming overhead, the rest of the mine was no less forgiving. With temperatures sometimes reaching 40 degrees Celsius or over 100 Fahrenheit, many of the miners were forced to work almost naked to avoid passing out from heat stroke. Some didn't even wear work boots because they would fill with sweat, which would then put them at risk of trench foot. And all of this would have been done in total darkness if not for one thing. Before entering the mine every day, the workers would collect a handful of clay from a pile on the surface and use it to stick a candle on top of their heads or in later decades onto their helmets. Since each man needed both hands to work, climb, and use their tools, lanterns weren't a possibility, and the mines were too massive to hang lights along every passage and keep them all fueled. So as strange as it looked, this was the only real way to see anything down there. Of course, this came with a whole new set of problems too. Candles would regularly blow out during work and would need to be relit, so the men carried matches in waterproof brass containers. But incredibly, even that is just the start of it. Each day, hundreds of men would climb down into the mine through one of its shafts with 80 ladders between them and the bottom level. Once they were down there, they'd use hand drills to dig thin channels into the rock about 1.5 feet deep to fill with gunpowder. A fuse would then be set and the tunnel would be cleared while the men waited for the explosion to shatter the next couple hundred feet worth of stone. Afterwards, they'd go back in and clear the debris with hand tools. More delicate areas, on the other hand, were done entirely using hand tools, and after the miners passed through, other teams would bring logs and wooden planks in behind them to shore up the passageway, then repeat the process all over again. All the while, hundreds of tons of stone and ore need to be hauled kilometers back to the mine shafts every day where they could be lifted up and processed. This involved using several 100-pound minecarts pulled by horses and mules accustomed to working underground. To make things worse and even more tiring than they already sound, at the end of a full day's work, men still need to climb back up and out of the mine up the 80 flights of ladders if they were at the very bottom. This process could take a full hour and a half, not to mention the walk back to their hometowns afterward. And to add insult to injury, the possible 3 hours a day spent climbing ladders wasn't paid time. You were only on the clock when you actually got to your floor of the mine for one of the 3 8-hour shifts each day, except Sunday. All things considered, the Levant mine certainly sounds like one of the worst jobs a person can have. But despite this, between 300 and 700 people worked at the mine most years, about 2/3 of them underground. The remainder on the surface included many women, children, and men with injuries that kept them from working down below. Their jobs were to break up the ore into fist-sized chunks with hammers and sorted by type for processing. And those who did work down below could be as young as 14 and included many people who were desperate and couldn't find work elsewhere. It also wasn't uncommon for exhausted men to fall from the ladders at the end of their workdays. And even more injuries were caused by loose gunpowder wafting into the air and igniting on the workers' candles, blinding them or setting off premature explosions. Afterward, men who were unconscious or too injured to make the climb back up would be hauled up with ropes, or later on, one of these skips, which were a pair of buckets that had their own dedicated shaft for lifting stone and ore out of the mines. By 1840, engines were starting to become a little more common and began to be used in the mine, and this is how those skips were powered. Basically, these two buckets moved along vertical tracks inside of a mine shaft with a cable linking both of them over a pulley at the top. So when one went down, the other came up. This meant that the steam engine powering them only needed to generate enough power to move the ore itself and not the skips, since they would counterbalance one another. Then in 1857, 37 years into the mine's operation, there was another new innovation. A new system was installed for the workers to get in and out of the mine. This new system would come to be known as a man engine. A man engine was like a vertical conveyor belt or lift system with platforms for the men to stand on. It required that a 1,000-foot wooden rod be inserted into the mine shaft. Then, every 12 feet, there was a little wooden platform attached to this rod and a handlebar at chest height. Then at the top of this rod, at the surface, there was an engine which lifted the rod up 12 feet and then lowered it back down 12 feet. So the miners would wait for the platform to come down, step onto it, and be raised up 12 feet. Then at the highest point, they would step off onto a platform attached to the mineshaft wall. Then they'd wait for the next platform to come back down before stepping back on and repeating the process 137 more times to reach the surface from the very bottom. Now, obviously, this sounds insane, and it was, but when the alternative was to climb 80 ladders back to back, it's also easy to see why the workers were actually happy about the new machine. Compared to the hour-and-a-half climb up the ladders, the man engine only took half an hour and was a lot safer for the exhausted miners in the long run. Though the danger of missing a step and falling was still there, it was an improvement for 1857 and even saw reduced rates of lung and heart issues and extended average lifespans for workers in mines that had them. And thanks to a series of gears, the engine was able to move the full 24-ton weight of the loaded rod with only 30 pounds of steam pressure per square inch. So regardless of how unusual it seemed, the man engine really was an improvement. On the other hand, the problem was that already by the 1850s, the first recognizable modern elevators had begun to be used. And even among similar man engines, the Levant man engine was sort of primitive. It only used one moving rod as opposed to two, which effectively doubled the time it took to reach the top or bottom because half the time was spent waiting on stationary ledges instead of stepping to a second moving rod. Additionally, it used a type of engine that could be choppy and unreliable. This was later replaced in 1893, but by then the man engine was practically ancient technology anyway. But despite this, it continued to be used for almost another 30 years. By 1919, 62 years of constant use had worn down components, rotted wood and heat and moisture of the mine shaft, and put the machine under the stress of millions of repetitions, carrying as many as 130 people at a time. Hundreds of individual parts were replaced over the years, but finally, it was too much anyway. On October 20th that year, the morning shift was winding down and miners were packing up and starting to make their way back to the surface around 3 p.m. Many of them had just survived World War I, only to return home to a struggling economy and few ways to support their families. Time and time again, those men and the workers before them had told management that the man engine wasn't safe. It was rickety and the parts shuddered as it moved. Many of the landings and steps had also been eaten away and not properly repaired, but management declined to do anything about it. Replacing the engine would cost a lot of money, and while there were plans to dig a new vertical shaft and install something a little more modern, work had yet to even begin. By then, the mine employed 331 people, with 187 of them working below ground. And as more and more people filed onto the little wooden steps, filling it nearly to capacity, just 18 inches from the top of the stroke, as most of the men were getting ready to step off, there was a bang. This was the sound of a bracket connecting the top beams to the rod that had been wearing down for 5 years since it was last replaced. In a single moment, it broke away and the 1,000-foot rod and all the men began to fall. Near the very top of the shaft, the men disappeared screaming as the only thing that they had to hold on to plummeted back into the mine shaft. As it did, it bent and buckled, breaking through the catchwings that were supposed to keep it in place. So after dropping the first 12 feet and slamming into the bottom of the mine shaft, the top 300 feet of the rod broke off and continued to fall on its own. Men farther down the engine began to realize something was happening and could hear what seemed like an avalanche of stone and wood coming down toward them. As the platform shook under their feet and started to slide, dozens of workers leapt onto the nearest ledge or the landings of different floors if they could. Others just held on for their life and found themselves sliding down level after level into the dark. As this happened, their candles were blown up by the sudden movement and the shaft was filled with the crashing sounds of rock all around as the rod buckled and dug into the wall of the mine shaft, causing a partial cave-in. Then a moment later, the dust began to settle, and the rumble of stone and metal was replaced with silence for a moment. And then, with the growing cries of men trapped, calling for help, many of them separated from one another and nearly all in total darkness. After the rod plummeted from the surface, the 300-foot piece that had broken off fell almost another 300 feet, shattering wooden beams and landings along the way before finally piercing the shaft wall and coming to a stop. In doing so, it had also completely blocked the tunnel by taking out so many of the supports. Then, down below, the rest of the rod had buckled but mostly remained in place, trapping the men on it deep underground. Back at the top of the mine, workers knew something had gone wrong, but not what or how bad it was. One of the few dozen workers who had just made it to the top when the break happened, a man named John Grenfell, volunteered to climb back down into the shaft and see what had happened. And almost immediately, he came across a group of dead and injured who were twisted between the wooden beams and rocks that completely sealed the tunnel. Horrifyingly, John's father was one of the site managers and he was one of the missing somewhere down below. Following the disaster, the emergency call went out as fast as people could carry it. Few, if any, places in that part of England had telephones at the time, but as word spread, off-duty miners came in droves from nearby towns. And hundreds more from neighboring mines like the Geaver mine and the Eastpool mine would also come to help. Friends, family, reporters, and others all arrived with them on the first day and then later. Once the rescue was underway, trying to save as many as they could was grueling work. Because the shaft had been so badly damaged, every rescuer had to be winched down into it on a rope. There, they would tie ropes around each and every piece of debris, lifting it up and out of the way while trying not to destabilize the shaft or cause more to fall. All of the stone and wood that could weigh hundreds of pounds need to be pulled up to clear the way to the survivors, and this would go on for days on end. And obviously, those trapped down below had their own challenges. After relighting their candles, if they still had them, over 100 men did their best to regroup. Many still had emergency ladders on their levels, which hadn't been knocked out, and were able to move around still, but there wasn't any chance of going up. Instead, they gathered everyone they could and helped the injured walk to the skip shaft and the water pumping shaft. Each of these was also equipped with emergency ladders and went the full distance to the surface. So 2 hours after the collapse, to the shock and relief of the rescuers, men from the bottom of the shafts began appearing out of the engine rooms and ore processing building. Then, incredibly, as exhausted as they were from a full day's work and then an unexpected climb, nearly all of them joined the rescue effort. Still by then, over 50 of their friends and coworkers were missing somewhere down below. In the end, it would take 3 whole days of digging, winching, and crawling through partially collapsed tunnels to rescue all the survivors. But the process was slow, and on many occasions, they weren't able to reach those calling for help before they fell silent. Among the dead, sadly, was John's father. The Levant mine and its workers all came from small towns and villages. Everyone knew everyone there, and each death was a friend or family member. Over the course of 3 days of constant rescue effort, the death toll rose to 31. 14 were found near the top of the pile at about 150 feet deep. Most of the rest were between 160 and 320 feet, and the final 3 were found at 420 feet, 480 feet, and 660 feet deep. These 3 were all as a result of being struck by falling debris. Among these tragedies were also many survivors. A boy named William Lowry, who was only 14 years old, spent 15 hours trapped beneath the body of another miner near the top of the pile before being rescued. He was actually the first to be pulled out and had a snapped collarbone, 8 broken ribs, and needed 36 stitches to his face and head, but would later make a full recovery. Another man named Nicholas Thomas held on for a whole 50 hours, only to pass away from exhaustion after he was rescued, on the way up to the surface. Tragically, 5 of the men killed had survived the First World War to get there, and nearly everyone in the county knew someone who died. This was devastating for the local communities. In addition to those who passed away, 19 miners suffered serious injuries of some kind, and not all of them were physical. A miner named Ralph Ellis was a veteran of World War I whose foster father was among those who was killed in the disaster. The next year, in 1920, Ralph was one of the first to arrive at another mine accident which resulted in the deaths of 4 others. This was the final straw for Ralph, and afterward he suffered a break and was never the same. An investigation following the collapse found that the bracket at the top of the rod, which had broken, was improperly made. The metal had internal faults, and that led to the controversial decision to label the event an accident. This removed all liability from the owners, despite the fact that no other mine in all of Cornwall was still using a man engine except the Levant. All of the rest had moved over to more modern, safer systems. This then left the families involved without any financial compensation, and many were forced to move out as they became unable to afford the rent of their houses. To try and offset things, a disaster fund was set up and people throughout the entire county contributed, hoping to raise £15,000. The mine's insurance company even paid out without the owners being found criminally responsible, and support and donations poured in from officials, news organizations, and local businesses. An anonymous author even wrote a poem about the disaster, sold for 2 pence each to contribute to the fund. But it could only stretch so far, and obviously couldn't bring anyone back. The mine itself continued for a few years until 1930, but it was a shadow of its former self. The price of tin in the post-war economy and then the 1930s depression made it impossible for the man engine to be replaced with a more modern system. In 1967, the mine's beam engine came into the care of the National Trust, which is a conservation agency, and was maintained as a historical piece. Other parts of the mine have been gradually rebuilt on the surface or brought back into working condition as historical pieces. The Levant mine remains open to the public to this day, but the underground portion is firmly sealed shut. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. And hopefully, I will see you in the next one. There is a terrifying phenomenon that occurs in the deepest and largest mines on Earth. And in 1958, this would occur in the deepest mine in North America, and the results would be catastrophic for the miners over 10,000 feet underground. This is that horrifying story, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Nova Scotia is one of Canada's 13 provinces and territories with a population of just more than 1 million in early 2024. Incredibly, among the country's provinces and territories, it's the second most densely populated as well as the second smallest by area. It's also home to a variety of natural resources, and so mining has been a central part of its economy for more than 300 years. Over that time, the province has exported more than 20 different mineral products all over the world, but beginning in the 18th century all the way through the better part of the 20th century, coal was king in Nova Scotia. It's estimated that around 400 million tons of it have been mined from more than 300 coal deposits since 1720. One of the most abundant of these mines in Nova Scotia's history is located in Spring Hill, which was a city of around 7,000 in the 1950s. Digging at these Spring Hill mines began in the 19th century and eventually became one of the deepest coal mines in North America, and also one of the deepest in the world with a depth of 4,260 feet or 1,300 meters. And during its heyday, the Spring Hill mine saw its share of success and a couple of horrific disasters. The first one was on February 21st, 1891, when an explosion occurred in the number 1 and number 2 collieries, which was caused by an accumulation of coal dust that was blown through both shafts by the ventilation system. The dust then ignited and caused one of the worst disasters in Nova Scotia's history, with 125 miners losing their lives. Then, 65 years later, another 39 miners were killed in November of 1956 when another blast occurred with circumstances oddly similar to the first explosion. A large quantity of fine coal dust was being carried toward the exit of the mine by a rail car, and on its journey, it passed through a strong gust from the ventilation system. This highly flammable dust then spread, which was then compounded when the train derailed and collided with a power line. And when it did, the electricity arced and lit the coal dust. Much like the first, this explosion and derailment was catastrophic for the community and the mine. Most of the number 4 shaft was destroyed, which trapped a handful of miners underground for some time until they were rescued. Then, once the survivors were out, the tunnels to the still raging fire were closed off with bricks to choke off its oxygen supply so it would burn itself out. By January of the following year, the bricks could finally be removed and the rest of the bodies recovered. However, the number 4 shaft would be closed permanently as a result. Incredibly, this could have been much worse if not for changes that had been implemented after the 1891 disaster, and new mining technology was credited with allowing 88 miners to escape with their lives. Part of the credit for that goes to a mining technique change that occurred about 20 years earlier. Mining coal can be done in a number of ways using a variety of processes, and from when the Spring Hill mine opened in the 1930s, the coal deposit there was mined using something known as the room and pillar technique. This is when long horizontal corridors are lined with timber supports that lead to different rooms where mining occurs. This is also done in a sort of grid pattern to help maintain the structural integrity of the mine. One of the disadvantages of this method, though, is that by leaving natural rock pillars to support the weight of the layer above, overall coal production couldn't reach its full potential because parts of the deposit quite literally supported the mine. Additionally, if the pillars in the tunnels weren't installed correctly, it could cause collapses. So eventually, Spring Hill switched to something known as longwall mining. This is when miners go back and forth across the whole face of a deposit to remove everything as they move forward. As the coal is extracted, hydraulic supports temporarily hold up the roof, and as the miners continue on, the roof of the mine sections behind them is allowed to collapse in a controlled way. Surprisingly, although this sounds more dangerous, this is actually considered safer than room and pillar mining. In addition, the longwall technique would yield around 80% recovery rate compared to the 60% using room and pillar. However, even with a safer technique and even with the best preparation, sometimes things happen that are entirely out of your control. It was mid-afternoon on October 23, 1958, when 45-year-old Maurice Ruddick, Levi Miley, and 172 other second-shift Spring Hill miners showed up for work. As the crew went to their various work areas, Maurice's mind was elsewhere. Earlier that day, he brought his wife and their brand new baby home from the hospital, which was the couple's 12th child. With so many mouths to feed, Maurice couldn't afford to take much time off, so even though he would much rather be at home helping his wife, he had to keep mining to provide for his family. While he daydreamed, the men stepped onto trolleys that took them to some of the deepest, darkest reaches of the mine. As was commonly the case on the long trip inside, the crew talked, joked, and even sang. Maurice was once in a quartet and loved the opportunity to sing with the other men he shared the mine with. Now, just as an aside, although the depth of the mine was 4,200 feet, the shafts were dug diagonally, and so many of the levels were assigned names based on their length instead of their depth. That's why the levels will have names that seem far longer than the total depth of the mine. Anyway, around the 13,000 foot level, or nearly 4,000 meters into the mine, Maurice and Levi hopped off the trolley and began making their way to the gigantic wall they'd be chipping away at. When they reached their work site, Maurice found himself starving, so he opened his lunchbox, grabbed a sandwich, and scarfed it down while preparing to move some coal with Levi. For the next 6 hours, the pair worked tirelessly, blasting coal off the wall using compressed air chipper picks and loading it onto the conveyor, which took it all the way to the mine carts that would carry it to the surface. They would do this all the way until their shift ended at 11 o'clock when the night crew would come to relieve them. As they worked, Maurice's thoughts returned to his family. By the time he'd get home, the kids and his wife would be fast asleep, but that didn't mean he couldn't spend some time marveling at the family's new addition, and he was looking forward to that. Several hours later, at exactly 8:05 p.m., he was slammed back to his senses as the ground started to shake. This was a feeling miners and Spring Hill residents were all too familiar with. The mines were so massive and so deep that the rock inside was constantly under more and more pressure. As coal was removed, so was the natural support the rock provided, which is why hydraulic supports and pillars were necessary to make up for that difference. Still, the amount of weight on the layer above was constantly growing, and even in the days leading up to that moment, the men noticed that the normally soft coal was hardening, making it much more difficult to remove. They knew that this meant something known as a bump was coming. This is a phenomenon that's generally only a problem for the largest of mines. A bump is literal seismic activity that's caused by the mine itself. Since weight is constantly shifting with the removal of rock and ore, stress starts to build and eventually the mine starts to shift. This can eventually cause a sudden, violent failure of the supports and earthquakes of varying strength. In fact, between March and September of that year, 6 large bumps had been recorded, and even earlier that same day, a smaller bump was felt but mostly ignored. In that instant though, Maurice and Levi knew that this wasn't just an average bump when the walls, floor, and ceilings started to collapse, shooting massive rocks in every direction. There were then 3 shockwaves that tore through the mine, closing exits with piles of heavy rock debris. Maurice had been standing near the top of the wall when it hit, and the sound was so deafening that it made him dizzy. Then, as quickly as it started, the bump came to an end as the noise from the shaking was replaced by the screams of men at nearly every level of the mine. As Maurice started to regain his wits, he found that he was buried up to his waist in coal. Then, turning his headlamp on, he could see nothing but coal dust all around him, knowing that if it ignited, he would burn to death. It wasn't until it all settled that he saw that the once tall tunnel was now only about 5 feet or 1.5 meters high. Maurice then began to check himself over because the situation was so disorienting that he wasn't even sure if he was hurt badly or not initially. Miraculously, other than a few small cuts and bruises, he was fine, and overall, considering the destruction around him, he was extremely lucky when many of his colleagues were not. After crawling out of the coal, Maurice came across another miner, a man named Percy Rector, whose arm had been squished between 2 large timber supports. Unfortunately, all the tools and equipment they had before the bump were now buried under the rubble, and there was no way to free him otherwise. So next, Maurice gathered up every aspirin the 7 men around him had on them and fed them to Percy. Then, once Percy's pain was addressed, Maurice looked around to size up their situation. The 7 men were now locked into an area around 50 feet or 15 meters long, 4 feet or just over a meter wide, and just high enough to stand up in. All of the exits were completely closed off otherwise. So, with nothing to do but wait, the miners lay down on the ground, uncertain of when or if they could be rescued. Almost as soon as the bump dissipated, Spring Hill citizens started arriving at the mine. Everyone who lived there at least knew someone who worked in the mines, but the vast majority of the town was made up of mining families. Many of them would even joke that if the Spring Hill mines weren't there, the city of 7,000 at the time would have a population of just 500 people. As mine officials started to assess the situation, they discovered that the phones to levels below 7,800 feet were completely knocked out. George Calder, the manager of the number 2 shaft, then immediately ordered the train cars off the tracks and for trolleys to begin bringing men out of the mine. The rescue effort was going to need a lot of men on foot too, but when the ground erupted less than an hour earlier, dangerous levels of carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide were released and flooded the mine. However, this didn't matter to George and many of the uninjured miners who were ready to get in there and rescue their fellow crewmen. With 20 volunteers, George told the rescue coordinator to summon the Draggermen before the group he was leading began down the slope of the number 2 shaft. The Draggermen were named for the company that manufactured their breathing equipment, and they were a specialized group of mine rescuers who were often responsible for clearing noxious gas from the tunnels. They carried 2 hours worth of air each, which gave them much more time in dangerous rescue situations. That first crew of rescuers led by George didn't have to go very far before the destruction inside the mine was clear though. Floors and ceilings at multiple levels had collapsed, creating obstructions for rescuers trying to get to the further reaches. In fact, most of the shift that night was working on levels at 13,000 feet and 13,800 feet. When George and his group reached the area where the majority of miners were supposed to be, they were greeted with a horrible sight. The levels were completely jammed up with debris, and getting beyond the rockfalls was going to be a challenge, especially with gases at 13,000 feet starting to affect the rescuers. It took the better part of the next 3 hours for them to create enough of an opening to burrow through, and when they made it, they found 13 miners trapped on the other side. By that time, only 36 of 174 miners had made it out of the crumbling labyrinth below ground, and rescuers could hear the cries and groans of men in other sections they couldn't reach yet. As the sun rose over Spring Hill the next morning, the count of survivors who made it out reached 81. Among them, 15 were injured enough to need medical attention, and many of those who had escaped were working on the 13,400 foot levels and the 13,800 foot levels, but a further 93 men were unaccounted for on the 13,000 foot level. As the picture of the disaster became more and more clear, another terrifying discovery was made. Those who weren't working inside galleries or who hadn't been able to take appropriate shelter had been completely crushed between the floors, ceilings, and walls that gave way during the bump. And rescuers began to find pieces everywhere as they continued. The number of those still lost was uncertain, but it was clear that the toll would be considerable. And at around 5:45 on the morning of October 24th, the body of the first dead miner was removed from the mine and taken to the morgue. Outside the mine, the crowd had grown to include nearly all of Spring Hill, and they were joined by reporters from media outlets all over. Also arriving at Spring Hill that morning was Harold Gordon, the coal chief of Dosco, which owned the company that ran the mine. In the 1956 disaster 2 years earlier, it was actually Harold who led the rescue effort. As soon as he learned of this new incident, he jumped into his car and drove 300 miles to the scene and arrived in the early hours of October 24th. Then, once he was there, he wasted very little time and entered the mine with another group of rescuers to assess the situation. 9 hours later, he returned with grim news. He believed all 93 of the remaining missing men were dead, and he told reporters as much through a cracking voice. Harold was wrong though. The 7 men that included Maurice were still alive and waiting for rescue. They could hear what was going on around them, but it seemed like the noise never got much closer. Then in another area where Levi was working when the bump hit, he was putting wooden supports into the roof near the top of the 13,000-foot level. The force of the jolts threw him off his scaffold and onto the rock floor below, but somehow he scrambled into a small rock cove not much bigger than the one Maurice was trapped in. And just like Maurice, Levi wasn't alone. With him were 11 more miners, but one of which was badly hurt. The man's leg was trapped under debris, almost certainly broken, and any movement of the rocks around him caused him agonizing pain. There was unfortunately nothing anyone could do for him though. He'd have to remain there until rescue arrived, whenever that would occur. For days afterward, only bodies were recovered by the dejected rescuers coming out of the mine. And for those who were still alive and trapped below, the longer they were held captive, the more starvation and dehydration became a concern. Both Maurice and Levi's respective groups pooled all their food and water together and rationed out. The supplies wouldn't last forever, but at least what they had would buy the rescuers more time to reach them. Maurice's group even divvied up some chewing tobacco one of the men had. And while none of the trapped miners had much, they had hope that was kept alive by the constant sound of rescuers feverishly working to reach them. Each of the mine's levels also had a series of pipes running through, which Maurice's group pounded on in an effort to let the others know they were still alive, but even after days of this, they never received a response. A few of the survivors even tried to burrow out, but only made it about 60 feet or 18 meters before they could go no further. Throughout it all, Maurice and his fellow survivors did what they could to keep spirits high. Monday, October 27th, was the 29th birthday of one of the men trapped with Maurice, so they took a sandwich and divided it up among each of them before singing happy birthday. But then, tragically, the next day, Percy succumbed to his devastating arm injury. For days before he passed, he begged the others to remove the arm, but no one had a knife. By that point as well, they were living in complete darkness. All the headlamps had died, and not long after, they ran out of food and water. In an attempt to stave off hunger, some of them even tried eating the dried bark off some of the timber, but this proved to be inedible when it quickly came back up. And 6 days after the bump, the high hopes of rescue had dwindled both inside and outside the mine. That was until it came rushing back on October 29th. That day, a mining engineer was at the 13,000-foot level, testing the levels of harmful gases when he thought he heard the faint sound of talking. There seemed to be no way that anyone could still be alive after all that time, but he stopped to listen anyway. Then,